So before I begin, I want to acknowledge Australia's historic Anglo-Celtic nation. Not other things, acknowledge us. Now tonight, I want to review some of the key justifications for having an organisation that represents the interests of Anglo-Celtic Australians, the majority ethnic group and the founding ethnic group. Organisations such as the British Australian Community, that Harry is president of. I will argue that the BAC is both needed and moral, and I shall suggest that political theory pushes in the same direction. Now let's start with the need for such a defence agency. It seems to me that the Anglo-Celtic Defence Organisation, such an organisation, has been needed for decades. Consider our situation. The heights of Australian politics and culture have been occupied by leftist multicultural establishment. Anglo-Celtic Australians, including all those who have assimilated into that identity, it's a broad category. It's probably 80% of the Australian population or more. We have been subordinated to globalist and minority interests. The trend has been apparent for decades in politics and the culture industries. The process began in the universities and mass media a century ago and accelerated during the Cold War. As a result, Australia's Western identity is ever more obscured. It is being drowned by indiscriminate immigration and oppressed by globalist elites. Opinion surveys such as the annual Scanlon polls, has anyone heard of that, the Scanlon polls? It's a big deal. They're distributed free to every member of Parliament, federal and state. They indicate that social cohesion is breaking down in Australia, the historic Australian nation. By that I mean the Anglo-Celtic core, whose history anchors the country to the First Fleet and to British history before that, is assailed from all sides at a time when the nation is leaderless, not protected by the sinews of government, but instead tied up and gagged by them. In particular, for decades, immigrants have not been selected to be compatible with national identity. That used to be that was for our history. From the beginning, that was the trend. We welcome immigrants who can readily assimilate. This has resulted in dangerous levels of diversity, unknown social weakness. It is unwise, to say the least, to have immigration and refugee intakes that are so high. Indeed, white Australians are sinking towards minority status in their own country. China and India are, in effect, colonising Australia. This is bound to lower social cohesion, and it is likely to endanger stable relations with China and India, both rising regional powers. Furthermore, schools indoctrinate Australian children to despise their ancestors and national history. United Nations mandates have been used to justify restricting freedom of speech and of association. All of this is compatible with ideological capture, with the view that multicultural forces have taken the Commonwealth and turned it against the interests of the people that created it. There is a need for a democratic multiculturalism that provides fair representation for Anglo-Australians. And that's really what the BAC is about. I think this narrative does justify a self-conscious defence of Australia's founding ethnicity. The same conclusion is reached by considering political theory. Now I get a little bit academic, but forgive me. Nationalism is at heart the aspiration for self-government of a people, for independence. The wish for national sovereignty is felt around the world. It's not a European thing or a Western thing, it's a human thing. It is a human universal. As British historian Anthony Smith argued, nations develop around the core of a founding ethnic group. The rise of democracy accommodated popular nationalism. This is the beginning in the early 19th century. Wherever democracy arose, the founding people voted to retain national independence, including demographically. They wanted to remain the majority in their own country. That's completely normal. They wanted to remain the majority, which in a democracy is the main condition for keeping control of the state, Conversely, and as a result, the state protected the vital interests of the majority. And as nationalism of this kind spread, the wish for national self-determination, empire after empire exploded and collapsed. This was the main driver of the end of the age of empires. That relationship between people and state is the foundation of democratic nations, which have two elements. A strong bottom-up democratic component, the will of the people, in other words, expressed through the ballot box typically, and an important top-down component exercised by elites who identify with the nation and are respectful of the popular will. That's the sort of the model nation state as it developed. Australia's democratic national state has been replaced by a globalist, multicultural one that is ruled disproportionately by top-down managerial elites who no longer identify with Anglo-Celtic Australia, even when, as is usual, they come objectively from that ethnicity. Right? So this is an ideological phenomenon largely. As a consequence, these elites are often indifferent towards national interests. Now, I want to give an example of this. It really came to a head in 1988 during the bicentenary, a famous speech by Prime Minister of the time, Bob Hawke. Okay, now this is a classic example of what I've been talking about, where elites basically abandon the people. A stunning admission of the subordination of Anglo-Celtic Australians came in a speech by Prime Minister Bob Hawke on the occasion of the bicentenary. He was speaking at Sydney Harbour. Hawke sought to define Australia's national identity, which a Prime Minister should do. That's the appropriate thing to do, talk about who we are, with an act of leadership, until he opened his mouth. Instead of drawing on history or culture or ethnicity to argue his case, the Prime Minister stated that our identity consisted of commitment to Australia. So it was interesting. In other words, that identity consists of loyalty. Sounds to me like apples and oranges. The Prime Minister did not address the apparent circularity of this definition. More credibly, he then sounded a bit better. He stated that Australians share the same homeland, that's true, and, quote, the same institutions, that's true, standards, language and culture. Oh, okay, sounding better. It's beginning to sound better. This was standard civic nationalism, which is now adopted by both sides of politics. Hawke did not remark, now it gets a little nasty, Hawke did not remark that those institutions, standards, language and culture were almost wholly derived from the British Isles. Indeed, at no point in his speech did he mention Britain. Nor did he note that during Australia's formative period, encompassing the pioneering of farms, roads and cities, the creation of the 6 states, the establishment of federation and the sacrifice of 2 world wars, most Australians thought positively of their British origin. Hawke declared that Australia has, quote, no hierarchy of descents, no hierarchy of descents, no privilege of origin. What was he getting at? This was extreme rhetoric, but his meaning was mundane. When we actually unpack what he was saying that Australians do not show degrees of national identity. Now think about that for a while. He's saying that this is an empirical statement. It's a matter of fact. It's either true or it's false. I think it's completely false, by the way. That Australia does not contain some individuals and groups that more closely resemble the national identity than others. He was saying all categories, including 6th-generation Australians who arrived, ancestors arrived in the First Fleet, and including immigrants who just stepped off the jumbo jet and been handed their citizenship papers. They're all equally Australian. And he's talking about identity, national identity. And what he defined it as was a legal document, citizenship. The fact that Hawke was not ridiculed or criticised by the media, by academics or by conservative opponents for his remarks means that in 1988, Anglo-Celtic Australians had few, if any, advocates. The fact is, it was safe for a politician such as Hawke to declare people of our ethnicity to be irrelevant to national identity, in effect designating them to be a stateless people. It means that the Commonwealth had in effect been stolen from those who made it. Now I want to talk about some research on this notion that the Commonwealth has been somehow stolen. There's actually extensive research on that topic, direct and indirect. Australian political scientist David Brown has pointed out that when the Commonwealth adopted multicultural ideology, it licensed minority ethnicity, but did not license the majority Anglo-Celtic ethnicity. This was a reversal of but licensed, approved, allowed, okay? This was a reversal of Australia's long nation-building practice in which the colonies, and from 1901 the Commonwealth, licensed Anglo-Celtic ethnicity, for example, by implementing immigration policy that strengthened them demographically. We selected immigrants, okay? We selected immigrants so that we would remain who we are, who we were. And the result was modern Australia. On a different topic, sociologist Frank Furedi has documented the ideological war being waged by state departments of education to indoctrinate our school children to reject their Western heritage. It's just a fact. Across Australia, departments of education have been radicalised. The problem goes beyond education to include the media and entertainment. The phenomenon of states turning against their founding nations is common to the Anglosphere and many other Western societies. For example, British historian David Starkey notes that the political establishment of that country rules in the interests of minorities. It's an extraordinary thing. That's what we've come to in multicultural society. What multiculturalism actually means is ruling in the interests of minorities and against the interests of the majority, of the founding majority. The American professor Victor Davis Hanson, he's a big name now in the United States, observes that every public institution in the United States is dominated by intolerant leftist ideology, which includes liberal immigration and aggressive multiculturalism. The Canadian sociologist Eric Kaufmann, he's my favourite among these, analysed the history of left liberalism in the United States. He documented the rise of multiculturalism in that country, finding that from its beginning in the 1970s, Anglo-Americans were excluded from that spoil system. He called this asymmetrical multiculturalism. The term's, by the way, gaining usage. I heard it used on Sky News yesterday. The British Australian community advocates that the majority be consulted, at least consulted, in matters affecting our ethnic interests, and that ethnic diversity be kept within safe limits. The goal of the BAC is to use every legal means to ensure that this happens, which Harry Richardson shall describe in his talk. I just want to talk a bit about the multicultural strategy which the BAC advocates. So I'll finish by describing one of the BAC's approaches, the multicultural strategy. I shall explain why a body that represents the majority founding ethnicity would want to participate in a mode of politics, identity politics, that is many see as having caused so much harm. It seems to me that it is less disruptive to reform a system than to replace it. That's one argument in favour of joining the multicultural industry. The period of tyranny known as, shall we call it, first wave multiculturalism, which began in the 1970s and continues now. This might be ended or at least moderated, not by destroying the regime, but by joining and civilising it. That is the approach adopted by the BAC, to promote a second wave multiculturalism. characterised by democratic inclusion of all ethnicities. The lukewarm ethnic mobilisation of Anglo-Australians has proven to be destabilising. This is a big issue. This should be a big issue for patriots. Why don't Anglo-Australians, Anglo-Celtic Australians care? Why aren't they caring they're losing their country? Their representative organisations have faded over the decades, while minority grievance flourished, partly due to historical and sociological forces, and partly due to the tutelage from the radical left. It does seem that political multiculturalism, as we know it, can maintain a robust level of ethnocentrism down the generations by virtue of keeping identity in the political foreground. That is one achievement of political multiculturalism. It's kept people, I think, against all reason because they've not discriminated against in Australia. We're a very tolerant country, and yet they've been persuaded that we're a racist society. They need to keep on guard. They need to keep us down in some way, various ways. It is time that Anglo-Celtic Australians took identity politics seriously. We cannot afford to remain outside that spoils system and otherwise dispossessed of the Commonwealth. Nor should we allow runaway diversity to break national unity and ruin the life chances of our descendants. The situation is dire because there has been minimal to no pushback since around 1970. Anglophobic ideology has been allowed to reach absurd levels. For example, the mantra that diversity incurs no social costs, or that Australia does not rightly belong to those who made it, or that unlike Asia and Africa, the West is a racist set of countries in which only minorities should have legitimate ethnic interests. I suspect that even a small voice publicly calling out such absurdities will help dispel them. Now, getting towards the end, I want to talk about the potential power of the Anglo-Celtic lobby, which brings me to this potential question. How powerful can Anglo's identity politics realistically become? That's another question we should be thinking about. Is there a point? Is there a point in working towards preserving our people? What can be achieved with a culture impelled by such low ethnocentrism? Because that's what we have. After all, the weak ethnic motivation of Anglo-Celts probably has strategic consequences. Other factors being equal, such as group size, wealth, and competence at lobbying, weakly motivated ethnicities can be expected to lose out in politics to highly motivated, active groups. On the other hand, Australia's founding ethnic group is the largest population in Australia, and it is competent at organising. Anglo-Celtic Australians encompass the full range of professional expertise, with robust numbers engaged in social and economic management. How could it be otherwise? We built the country from scratch. The momentum of our historic nation held sway from until the 1960s, when new-class elites took control. Our organisational and political nous and hard work created the political structures of the 6 states and the Commonwealth. As a result, our population has large resources. The white middle class collectively wields large disposable capital. Consequently, we don't need to become as ethnically obsessed as those who lead minority organisations. Now, it's just as well. It's just as well because European populations are normally we're not very tribal. We're not a tribal what? We can be. We've got that potential. But normally we rate low on measures of collectiveness and high on individualism, very high on individualism. Extreme tribalism is not who we are or who we want to be, actually. So what I'm suggesting is that we get involved in the multicultural industry, play the multicultural game, but we don't have to do it in the manner that tiny minorities do, in a fanatical way. I've suggested that Anglo-Celtic ethnocentrism is dangerously low, but that it will be difficult, indeed unnatural, to raise it to minority levels. A reason to moderate recourse to ethnocentrism, in other words, not to push the tribalism too far, is that identity politics tends to incur significant costs. Collectivism usually undermines meritocracy and bloats government. These costs are associated with block voting and rejection of free speech, both of which undermine democracy. And don't we see that happening in multiculturalism against us, against our group? On the other hand, the majority ethnic group does not have the luxury of open-ended tribalism. Even if we wanted to do that, it would be irresponsible. The majority have the responsibility to run the country. The country still rests on our shoulders, whether we like it or not. We can't afford to behave in a way that minority multiculturalists behave and just go maximise their own power. We can't afford to do that. We have to run the country for everybody. For that, we need to provide stability and safety for all stakeholders. For example, by maintaining the rule of law and the legal tradition of the presumption of innocence. These liberal principles were upheld right through the colonial and nation-building periods in Australia, when the democratic hierarchy of dissents prevailed. A tolerant majority is a precondition for a stable society. That necessitates a majority that feels secure, not due to being fed lies and censorship, as it is now, but due to sound government policy. Of course, in a democracy, the majority entity should hold sway. Of course, if it's a democratic society, the majority should generally get its way in various policies that it cares about. It should not be persecuted by the political elites. But that sway should be as relaxed and benevolent as possible. Despite these considerations, survival comes first, in this case the continuity of the Anglo-core nation controlling its state, the Commonwealth in our case. That is the conundrum faced by all ethnic groups. It is the tragedy of ethno-religious diversity. For the same reason, Anglo-Celtic leaders should use any victory in identity politics to return Australia to its historical norm of relaxed ethnic affairs, exercised by liberal democratic institutions with moderation, rule of law, and individual civil liberties. The degree of relaxation that we can achieve with political and cultural power will depend on rebuilding relative demographic and cultural strength. We can't achieve this relaxed control of Australia's future if we're in the minority. We just can't do it. If Australia has a future of self-rule and Western identity, it will be built around a white majority served by patriotic NGOs and political parties. Only then will it be possible to relax measures for maintaining popular ethnocentrism. To conclude, the political potential of Anglo-Celtic identity politics is massive. Minorities have built effective lobbies despite their tiny population bases. Even a slight increase in average ethnocentrism among Anglo-Celts, affecting such a large number of people, would generate considerable activism. The aim should be to build a powerful set of explicitly Anglo-Celtic organisations able to represent community interests through lobbying and cultural engagement. The point is that Anglo-Celts' mild ethnic consciousness can be retained. We can remain who we are, but only if we build organisations that represent our interests at various levels of government. Anglo-Celtic defence agencies are not only justified, they are imperative. Thank you very much.